Broombot Battlegrounds.
It's been just over 2 years since the release of my and the rest of the Cleanup Kings' first game on Steam, Broombot Battlegrounds. As I begin my transition into working with electronics and Arduinos for this channel, I wanted to do a post-mortem on the game that shaped the last few years of my life. Also, I'm recording this section nearly 3 months after the rest of this video because who would have guessed that a 2-hour video would take a long time to edit? So for the sake of getting a move on, I've decided to split this up into 2 videos. This first one will focus on the background of how the team met, the evolution of the game, and the various events that we showed it off at. Part 2, which is twice as long as this one, will focus on the mechanics and functionality of the game itself, primarily the parts that I worked on. Hello, my name is Nathan, and without further ado, let's talk about Broombot Battlegrounds. Broombot Battlegrounds is a multiplayer party arena battler game where you control legally distinct robot vacuum cleaners with a balloon and a knife in various game modes as you fight to the death, clean up the arena, or try to hold on to a crown. I served as the lead programmer and music composer. There were over a dozen people that had some hand in making the game at various points, but the core team of myself and 4 other people were the ones that did a vast majority of the work and were with the team for the entirety of the development cycle. From start to release on Steam, that was about 13 months, with more work after that dedicated to updates. The ideas and mechanics behind the game were heavily influenced by Mario Kart Balloon Battle, Boomerang Fu, and of course, that one Rooster Teeth video. Also, this video is technically not sponsored, so don't come after me, YouTube, even though I am technically promoting a game that I financially benefit from. How does this work again? Anyway, before I get into the nitty-gritty details of how the game works, I want to take a step back and go through the timeline of how the team met and the game's journey to being what it is today. The current version of the game started as a capstone project at DePaul University in Chicago in January 2022 and was made in Unreal Engine 4. There were 2 previous iterations before I joined in Capstone, the first being made in Game Maker Studio a few years prior by Gabe, the lead producer, then another made in Unity about a year and a half before Capstone, which is when Carter and Daniel joined, with a couple other people that didn't stay on permanently. The original version in Game Maker Studio was actually fully top-down and in 2D, but unfortunately there's no surviving gameplay of this version. Trust me, we've tried several times to look for it while making content for social media. The Unity project, however, still lives. You can see that the basic idea was already set, but the people in the group at that time were generally unhappy with working with Unity due to how the physics worked. During this phase, the game was called Roomba Doomba Death Battle, but was later changed so that we wouldn't get sued by Amazon. An artifact of this actually remains in the game itself, since the executable file of the version on Steam is still called Secret Project RDDB.exe. Getting to the Capstone class and when I joined, everyone in the class was semi-randomly assigned into groups, and I got very lucky to be put with this crew. At the time, I was immediately relieved to see that not only did the pre-existing group have an idea for a game, but also already had some design elements worked out. Not to mention, I really wanted to work with Unreal Engine, because I'd used Unity before, but I wanted to learn Unreal because the master's program I was in for game programming at DePaul had a major emphasis on C++, which I ended up not using a ton of, but I'll come back to that point later. In hindsight, I feel even luckier to have been grouped with them, because it was by far the most fun project I've ever worked on, and with how much time and effort I dedicated to these little vacuums, I couldn't imagine my life without it. This part is a bit of an aside, but most of the other groups in our class seemed to not have the same amount of cohesion as we did, and ended up with little to show at the final showcase. I won't get into the class politics as to why this happened, but the fact that half of our group had already worked together, and on this concept no less, helped us a ton to hit the ground running. The reason I was placed in this group takes me into how the class worked, because it does go a little bit beyond being purely random. Spanning over 2 quarters, meaning from January to June at DePaul, the Game Development Capstone course was offered to anyone majoring in a related field, including designers, programmers, and artists. The sound designers and playtesters technically had their own classes that coincided with this one, which I'll mention more of in a moment. Since there was a wide variety of skill sets among the students, we were divided up based on how many people there were of each of us, outside of any pre-existing groups, of course. The class was largely dominated by game design majors and 3D artists, so as one of the few programmers, and even fewer who was in the master's program instead of the bachelor's, I quickly realized that I might not get a ton of help on my end. To be honest, I had actually preferred this, because needing to do a larger variety of things meant that I would learn even more about Unreal. I also hadn't done many group projects at that point, so having a bit more room to work took away some of my nerves about people stepping on each other's toes. Another thing that I listed for what I could contribute on the initial form was that I wanted to make the music as well, and if I remember right, there were only a few other composers in the class. After everything was said and done, I ended up on a team of 9 people and we called ourselves 2 AM Beans. Honestly, for the longest time, I thought that name came from a meme about eating beans at 2 in the morning, but I guess it was referring to the need to drink coffee to continue working late at night? The earliest playable build I still have is from February 2nd, 2022. It's cool to see the old roots, even if they do look rather decayed in comparison to the tree. I was actually a little surprised to see looking back that we already had as many maps as we did after only a few weeks. I'm even more surprised to see that we had already added in a player outline for when players go behind objects. As a side note, I want to give some advice to any current or future game devs. Archive the builds of your game as you make them. I am so thankful I kept track of these throughout the process because I'd otherwise have a lot more trouble getting footage for this video. I briefly mentioned the sound designers and playtesters, and their classes obviously focused more on work in their specific area. The biggest project for them involved forming their own teams and being paired up with one of the teams in our class. The playtesters didn't exactly give the most useful information, but the sound designers were a godsend. A lot of the sound effects you hear in the final version of the game were either found or made by them. After the first quarter ended, give or take a week or two, this is what the game looked like. By this point, we'd implemented a rudimentary form of Clean of the Hill, featuring dust collection and everything. We had implemented the dash and jump features, but they don't quite work for me now because the physics were still tied to the frame rate, and I've since upgraded to a much nicer computer that runs the game at a higher FPS. I actually showed this exact build to my family at the time, and it's crazy to me to think that this is the version that I showed off because it's so far from what I'm used to the game being. Around this time, I was also starting to lose a bit of motivation for a couple of reasons. The first is simply burnout after working with Broombots for a few months, almost non-stop, to the point where they started to appear in my dreams, if I'm being honest. The code was also starting to feel a bit messy, since I was still in the mindset of get this feature done and implemented, it doesn't matter how, I can always fix it later. While this mindset can work in the short term during crunch, it's definitely not sustainable. A lot of time was spent later optimizing this early code. Tie all of that in with how new I still was with Unreal and the pressure of my other classes, and I was definitely needing a short break. So what do you do when you feel like you've been staring at Unreal Engine for so long that your eyes feel like they're about to fall out? Why? You work on a game jam, of course. To be fair, it was only a weekend-long jam, and I did take the following week away from Unreal. Not to get too off track, but it was made for Ludum Dare 50, where the theme was Delay the Inevitable. My interpretation of this, called Solar Shield, was set on a planet that's close to a star that keeps creating intense solar flares. There's a timer that keeps ticking down to 0, and when it does, the player dies. Various things would make the timer move faster, including getting hit by enemies, using either of your weapons, or when a solar flare occurs, which activates the titular Solar Shield. The inevitable can be delayed by adding time back to the timer, which is done by destroying enemies and collecting the green fuel rods. It kind of turned into a classic high score focus game in one of my favorite aesthetics, which is the general neon synthwave Tron vibe. I'm honestly still super proud of this project, glaring flaws and all, because it was the first time I'd completed a game jam, and in 72 hours at that. Yes, it doesn't save the high score, all of the models are made out of basic shapes in Unreal, the font is completely unreadable, and the music doesn't loop properly, but I learned a lot from it. On that last point, I did a weird manual looping that causes a brief break in the music when it ends, because I didn't know the proper method yet. This showcases one of my biggest pieces of advice about Unreal, which is especially helpful given how lackluster the documentation can be. When in doubt, it's probably a checkbox. I cannot even count the number of times during Broombot production where someone couldn't figure out how to make something work, then after intensive research, we found it was just a simple checkbox toggle. Case in point, I later realized that you can go into the audio file in Unreal and just... yeah. Back to Broombot. This is the version of the game we had at the end of Capstone. By this point, we had created menus that actually looked good, done a lot of polishing, and added a lot more maps. We even got the dash and jump physics working correctly, although the levels do feel a bit empty compared to now, especially the classroom level that was called Kindergarten at the time. Now that the capstone was at the end, it was time to show off the game. The first event was in Indicate Horizons, where our game got picked to be shown off during the 2022 Student Project livestream. It was mind-blowing to see our game in this type of setting for the first time. By the way, get used to me saying this type of thing whenever I bring up showcasing the game in any format, because I repeat myself a bit. Coincidentally, a game from Bradley University was shown right next to ours that my friend from high school had worked on, which made the event even cooler. That game was Disaster Golf, which I also recommend everyone go check out on Steam right now. Pause the video, I'll wait. Okay. The next event was the Big Capstone Showcase, which included all of the games from our class, the Autumn Sessions class, and the MS in Game Design Capstone class. There were a lot of cool games, some admittedly being a bit artsy, but seeing all the passion clearly on display was spectacular. Since Broombot is a party-style game, we ended up with nearly an entire room to give people enough space. The decorations turned out looking great as well, but the amount of balloons did become a hazard once they started popping and at the end when we needed to do cleanup. However, we were aware of some issues in the game at the time, and there was a lot of things that we were disappointed in not being able to get done on time. For example, it was very easy for the controllers to get screwed up, completely ruining Clean of the Hill, which has a split screen mode, more on that later, and required a game relaunch. Another issue was spotted where two players could get stuck inside of each other due to a gap in the collision of the Broombot's body and weapon. Similarly, the weapons would seem to not track to the body when the Broombot would flip itself over. Don't get me wrong, this made for some excellent playtesting notes, but we were all super embarrassed about this happening during the big showcase. Although here's another crucial piece of advice, and what might honestly be my biggest takeaway from the entirety of working on Broombot, because it can be applied to just about anything in life. Remember to take a step back and appreciate what you've accomplished. Yes, it might be flawed, and there might always be something more that you could do to make it better, but you still managed to do it. The reason I bring this up is for a moment in the showcase that I don't think I'll ever forget. As I was furiously writing down notes on bugs to fix and stressing out over how I could have possibly missed them, a group of people had come by to try it out. After a little bit of playtesting and laughing, one of them said the one thing that blew us all away. "When can I buy this?" We had spent the last hour ashamed of what we viewed as a broken mess, and yet she had completely reshifted our perspectives in an instant. Sure, we received plenty of compliments, but this one really secured the fact that we would continue working on Broombot until that question was given a reality. Since everyone in the group besides me had also just graduated, we had a brief break before resuming work. Not everyone on the team stayed, with some leaving right away, others after a bit more time, but by autumn we were condensed down to the core team of 5 people. Of the other 4 people in the core team, we had Carter, the design director who made nearly all of the levels and handled a lot of the background things that come along with making a game, like scheduling. Gabe, the lead producer who also handled a lot of the background and legal things and was the one to come up with the original idea for the game. Daniel, a jack of all trades who had a hand in working on programming, visual effects, and all of the 2D art you see throughout the game. And Adam, the lead 3D artist who made a vast majority of the 3D models in the game. One of the sound design artists, Maggie, had stayed on for a little bit as well. A few more people would join briefly over the course of the project too, to varying degrees, but never for an extended period. At the end of the day, not everyone is going to have the time to dedicate the same amount of effort into a project like this, and there's nothing wrong with that. As we continued work, we knew the likelihood of making any real amount of money from it, but we continued regardless because we enjoyed it and knew it would open future job opportunities from having this experience. There's too many people to mention here, so if you want the full list of people that worked on Broombot, check out the credits in the game. Around the same time as the break, I did another game jam for GMTK 2022 for a game called Chromadice Rush. I worked on it with my friend Robert, who is also interested in making games, and he and his brother Richard have a ton of experience in 3D modeling with Blender. We did actually have to change the name from Chromadice because we saw it was already taken. Not that it really matters much for a game jam though. This game jam's theme was Roll of the Dice, so we made a puzzle game where you move a die across a course by pressing the number that corresponds to the direction you want to go. You essentially push whichever side has the number you pressed. It's like if you combine Bloxors with the difficulty of QWOP. The controls are purposely janky because we wanted to make a game that would take effort to learn as something that could be speedran. We had a lot of ideas for more levels and animations for before and after levels, but I think we made a decent demo in the 48 hours that we had. Anyway, the Broombot crew started back up with regular meetings on Tuesdays and Saturdays. This is another piece of advice I have for anyone that wants to make anything like this, whether it be a game or something else. Have regular meetings. It keeps a sense of consistency in the workflow and motivates everyone to actually have something to present to the rest of the group every week. This is the best way to be aware of what everyone else is doing and track if you're keeping up with any deadlines you give yourselves. I forget when we actually started using the new team name, but we had made the transition from Beans to Kings. This time frame included a lot of necessary refactoring. One of the biggest things on my plate was to optimize the game modes. How it worked at the time was each game mode had its own set of functions, but a lot of these were redundant, such as Broombot spawning. It was a simple fix on paper to implement inheritance to make it go from this to this, but ensuring other components wouldn't break while also making the new functions more efficient took a good bit of time. Around here is when we started using C++ more as well. We started with 100% blueprints because we were all still new to using Unreal, and the non-C++ people still needed to be able to easily work on the game. Honestly, it is a perfectly valid way to make a game in Unreal due to how well it can run, and newer versions keep optimizing blueprints to be nearly as efficient as regular C++. That being said, there are definitely use cases where it is necessary. The Dust That's in Clean of the Hill is a good example of this, because we needed it to be more lightweight due to how many of these things are in a level at once. A lot of new features were rapidly added over the next few months, since our original goal to publish was October 2022. This was ambitious, to say the least. My favorite addition in this period was definitely the power-ups, but more on them when I get to the technical portion of this video. The thing that pushed it back the most was definitely going through the Steam process. Shout out to Carter and Gabe for handling all of that. But the game was also just simply not finished yet. Regardless, we were still wrapping up for a release, and that meant starting a social media presence. Carter handled posting on the platform formerly known as Twitter, while I made most of the short-form videos for TikTok and YouTube Shorts.
I am in Spain without the A.
You're in Spin?
Wait!
It goes in the square hole.
And let me see what you have. No!
We then added Maria to the team, who is a public relations and advertising major, to help out with social media in general, and she's the person that is responsible for our lovely website. We then attended our first convention as the team, that being MDev 2022 in Madison, Wisconsin. Since we were all in the Chicago area and didn't want to pay for hotel rooms, that meant hitting the road extremely early to get there in time. Not everyone was able to go, but that ended up working out fine because it meant we would all fit into a single car easier. I was the driver, and the first stop was actually to pick up something very special. Robert, the person I worked on Chromadice Rush with, had recently joined the team to help out with some 3D modeling, and created this little guy to show off at conventions. This was fantastic to see, and turned a number of heads our way at the convention. You can see just how excited we were to see the Broombot for the first time in real life here.
Yeah, so sorry, I wanted to go and catch you. Check this out. Fold it real quick.
Oh my god, it's heavier than I thought.
Press it.
Okay.
Yo! Holy sh!
Oh my god.
Carter!
Oh my god.
There's a button on the
How
back.
do you turn it on?
That is sweet.
Oh my god.
Oh,
Look at the Broombot. Oh my god. It's
That's
real.
awesome.
It's real, Mom. The Broombot is real.
By the way, Robert and Richard do have their own Etsy shop where they sell various 3D prints, like the trophies for Mario Kart, as well as a CNC machining shop, so go check them out as well. Once we got to Madison, we set up our booth and had a fantastic day talking with people interested in Broombot. I was initially nervous about not screwing up the pitch to anyone potentially interested in eventually buying the game, but I got into the groove of things fairly quickly. One of the key things I picked up on was to give as general a summary as possible, which you saw around the start of this video. Then if they had more specific questions, figure out which one of us they should talk to. For example, if they wanted to talk about the code behind specific mechanics or the music, I'd be the person to get into that with them. If they were interested in level design or the overall game design, I'd direct them to Carter, and if they wanted to know more about the 3D models, I'd point them towards Adam. It was also super fun to chat with other small studios in the neighboring booths. Unfortunately, I don't recall the names of most of the games I saw there, but I do remember having a great conversation with the dev of a game called Uncle Nook's Monster Emporium, which I also recommend taking a look at on Steam. One of the coolest things to happen here was when a talent agent from Epic Games, the company that makes Unreal Engine and nothing else, walked up and asked for our pitch. He turned into a contact that provided us a lot of help in terms of navigating the road to Steam approval, as well as questions about working with Unreal in general. After the convention was over, we stopped at Red Robin for dinner, then made the trek back to Chicago, excitedly discussing new mechanics the entire time due to all of the new ideas we had after a day of talking to fresh eyes. At this point, there isn't really a whole lot to say on my end for the final push to release in February. It was just a lot of work to get everything ready, and we used all of the time available. I remember being up late with Daniel and Carter the night before we had to submit the final build, combing through the game to see what last-minute changes we could make. This mostly just amounted to a few updated textures and last-second mechanic tweaks. Then we hit build and sent it in, and on Valentine's Day 2022, Broombot Battlegrounds was made available to purchase on Steam. It didn't have a huge reception by any means, but we did it. After a year and some change, we had built a video game from the ground up, and were finally able to sell it. So, what was next? Well, we already had plans for free updates to the game, which included new levels, game modes, music, and unlockable cosmetics. Obviously, this included plenty of bug fixes as well. Our next big event, however, was right around the corner, as we had gotten a booth to show off Broombot at PAX East 2023 in Boston. This was definitely my favorite experience to come out of working on Broombot, but it wasn't without its own hiccups. We obviously wanted to bring the 3D printed Broombot with us, but we didn't realize that there would be a snag in that plan as we got to the airport. Since there are a bunch of wires and Arduino components inside of it, it can look a little suspicious when viewed through the TSA's bag checking machine. Our buddy did end up getting pulled to the side and frisked, and it was a little funny to try and explain what it was to the confused TSA agent. Fortunately, he was cleared and did make it to Boston with us. The first thing that hit me when we stepped inside to set up was just how large of a convention PAX East is, as I'd never been to PAX before. Now, I have been to plenty of large cons before, C2E2 being an especially big one every year since 2019, but seeing one completely dedicated to video games with a ton of similar indie teams was awesome. Don't get me wrong, MDev was great, but that felt minuscule by comparison to the number of people we talked to here. As fun as it was, we were all completely exhausted by the end. Our booth ended up being in a really good spot on the corner of one of the indie dev aisles and a main walkway. Down that main aisle, about 100 feet away, was the massive section dedicated to the publisher Devolver, so we got a lot of runoff from them. The part of their booth that was facing us was for Call to the Lamb, and it slowly brainwashed me into buying the game by the time we left. You know, I'm just now realizing I think they might have actually inducted me into the cult just by osmosis of seeing it so much. We did get a brief moment to talk to the original devs as everything was being torn down on the last day, which ended up being a nice cherry on top of the whole weekend. Another standout booth that was right next to ours was for a little game called Farming Simulator, which kind of blew our minds even more than Devolver. They were awesome neighbors to have and talk to, and definitely gave us a bit more traffic by proximity. While the traction was great, none of us ever really got to sit still for very long, with there almost never not being someone waiting to check out Broombot. It was super useful though to do more playtesting and find new bugs. We had some exclusive things going on as well, like whoever had the biggest score in Clean of the Hill at the end of a given day would be sent a free key to the game on Steam, and a few groups who had really enjoyed it and were playing for multiple rounds were given access to trying out the new game mode Oddbot, which was still in the prototyping phase at that point. There was also someone we talked to that already knew about Broombot from seeing it on Twitter, which really stood out because our social media pages weren't exactly pulling the big numbers. But that does add to the general notion I've been getting at whenever I bring up these events, which is that it is so extremely cathartic to see people you don't know genuinely excited about a project you've spent months pouring your blood, sweat, and tears into.
Well, it was a pair of good three overall.
On the topic of interactions with people at the booth, there's one in particular I want to mention because I thought it was funny, and anyone on the team probably already knows where I'm going with this. We would all take turns on playing the game with people if there was ever not enough to play a full round. So when a man had walked up to the booth with his son, who couldn't have been older than 10 years old, Carter talked to the dad while I took the second controller. Apparently the kid was interested in going into game dev at some point, and the dad was asking around about the best way to have his son learn where to start, which tools to use, all of that. Meanwhile, I was going easy on the kid, letting him kill me as I got used to the controls. After some time though, he goes, "Wow, you really suck at this game." That's when I changed tactics. In the next round, I added 2 CPUs on the hardest difficulty and went all out in playing. There was an immediate difference in our scores, I'm not gonna lie. Was this extremely petty? Yes. However, he was still laughing, and admittedly he was still getting a good number of kills on me. The reason I bring this up is because after they left, Carter's reaction to this was hilarious. They were watching us play while we talked, and he could hardly keep a straight face while seeing this. The funniest thing he said was, I was having a nice conversation with this man about game development. Meanwhile, you were over here curb stomping his son while we watched. Once again, in my defense, the kid was very clearly enjoying the challenge after talking shit, and they were actually both back at the booth later that day to play more. PAX did end up being productive as well. Like I said earlier, we were able to do a little bit of early playtesting with the new game mode Oddbot, and even made some tweaks to it on the fly. Believe it or not, this is when single-stick controls got added. We had gotten feedback before that the existing twin-stick tank controls could be a bit tricky to learn, but that sentiment was echoed a lot on the first day of PAX. So when we got back to the hotel, I was able to very quickly implement it to be usable. This is one of those features that we hadn't given too much thought to add because of everything else we had to work on, but it was very clearly needed. To very quickly explain the difference to what was new and what people had already been using, the twin stick controls operated like an RC car, where the left stick would move the Broombot forward and backward, while the right stick would turn it clockwise or counterclockwise. For the single stick controls, the Broombot simply moves in the direction on the screen that matches the direction of the joystick. While I still prefer the original controls, especially since you almost get a competitive edge due to the higher level of control, the new version felt so much more natural to newcomers and ended up being well received the following day. The moral of the sub-story is to make sure that you spread your game to as many eyes as you can for feedback while you're still developing, because a small feature that might not even occur to you could wind up being a quality of life change that would be hard to imagine not being included. After returning from PAX, work on Broombot shifted to releasing updates, and our third one would include 2 new maps, Sewer and Boiler Room, as well as the new game mode, Oddbot. A couple weeks before that major update, we were actually invited back to DePaul's annual showcase to display Broombot again. Gabe and Carter did a whole presentation to a pretty decently sized crowd of students about releasing a video game, and we all got to answer questions at the end. The level of polish Broombot had compared to the previous showcase really highlighted how far we had come in the last year. Our journey wasn't quite finished just yet, but it felt like a sort of finale to look back on everything we'd managed to accomplish. Like we had really reached the summit. Although that could also be because I graduated the next day.
Nathan Guh-Roo.
Once that major update was out, production slowed down massively. Part of this was because we weren't sure how much longer we'd be able to keep working on Broombot, and it was at a stage we were all happy with leaving as is. We were also waiting on approval from Nintendo to start porting to Switch. If we weren't approved, that would almost certainly mark the end. We did end up getting Mario's approval and thus started work on porting and online multiplayer after getting the Switch dev kit. Something quickly became apparent, however, that I kind of already knew was approaching, which is that it was in our best interest to upgrade from Unreal Engine 4 to Unreal Engine 5. Not only this, but rebuilding the game from the ground up. Now, there were plenty of reasons for deciding to go this route, from the game running better overall due to the better engine, to being able to rework a lot of the mess that had come about from being so inexperienced in the beginning. There was also the issue of networking. The current game does technically support online multiplayer via Steam Remote Play, and it's actually more beneficial to the players because it only requires one copy of the game, since only one instance is running and is being streamed to everyone else. However, true online multiplayer was something that really should be implemented in a game like this, and it was required to have Broombot be anything more than couch co-op on Nintendo Switch. The thing about networking, though, is that it really needs to be considered and implemented from the start of development, and since we had no idea Broombot would make it this far at the start of Capstone, it was left out. So the plan was that while we rebuilt the game in UE5, networking would be much easier to add as everything else was being reconstructed and optimized. We knew this would be a lot of work, but it would end up being well worth it. Unfortunately, I couldn't afford to put the same amount of time into the game that I previously had, and the same could be said about most everyone else. I had just graduated and needed to get a proper programming job with my shiny new degree, and getting into this industry takes a lot of time and effort, especially now. After starting in June, I didn't even have anything locked down until the end of December. But even though production slowed down, it wouldn't be fully stopped for nearly another year, and we did attend MDev again in 2023. It seemed like it was much bigger than the previous year, despite being at the same location. They moved the section for the indie dev booths to the central hallway instead of a side room, and there were definitely a lot more teams to fill the larger space. Our booth was actually right by the entrance, which helped to get more eyes on us. I had a lot more great conversations with people, with my favorite being with a fellow music composer. That was really nice because most of the people you meet at these things are primarily interested in game design or programming, with artists being the next most common thing. He had quite an impressive portfolio and was currently composing for a game called Super Dungeon Designer, another one I recommend, which also had a booth set up there. A few hours into the day, we were informed that Broombot was picked to be part of a tournament that was being held. I should say that they were intentionally choosing a few games from the teams that had booths, so as one of the handful of multiplayer games and even fewer released games, it's not the biggest surprise in hindsight. That being said, it was still cool to watch people get really into the game and slowly figure out the strategies, like how using the brake allows you to turn faster. The surprises weren't over yet, as towards the end of the night, we were presented with a micro grant. Apparently, there was a group of some people going around as part of a group to vote on the best game, and we won. This was one of the most mind-blowing things to happen to us because we didn't even know it was happening. It was funny though, because a random person walked up to the booth a few minutes before to say congrats, and we had no idea what he was talking about. We celebrated by going to Red Robin for dinner again, technically making it a tradition, and headed home more excited than ever. However, this does unfortunately mark the beginning of the end of my journey, since a few weeks later I had finally secured a programming job. As part of a non-compete, I had to sign I wouldn't be able to write any new code for Broombot. I could still make all the music I wanted and help out by explaining my existing code though, but even that would wind up being very little due to how busy I'd be. We did actually get a new programmer on board to replace me, and it was none other than the professor from the original capstone class. The first big meeting we had with him had him showing us a bunch of new systems that were added to Unreal Engine 5 that would streamline nearly the entire game, which excited all of us. He also had experience in networking multiplayer games, which we definitely needed. Production did keep up for a few more months, but gradually slowed down. Everyone still working on the game was simply too busy with either work or school until it ended completely. Unfortunately, this kind of thing does happen sometimes, but as disappointing as it is to see our plans not come to fruition, you have to remember that we already fulfilled our original goal an entire year earlier. We wanted to make a game and release it, and we accomplished that. All of these other plans were more supplemental for polish. For a minuscule team with literally zero budget, I'd say we did pretty darn well. And that brings us all the way up to the present. And that's it for part 1. Like I said at the start of this video, part 2 will be a more in-depth discussion about the various mechanics and how the game itself works. Before that, I'll be uploading part 1 of my first electronics project, and new videos are currently planned for about every 4 weeks on Fridays. But for now, farewell, thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.